Ready to make a real impact every day? Join the Active Day Home Care team and help clients maintain their independence in the comfort of their own homes. Make a difference in someone's life as you provide essential daily assistance and protect their health and happiness. Earn up to $20 an hour and enjoy additional perks like optional daily pay, 401k, paid time off, ongoing educational training, and more. Join a team that values care, compassion, and your professional growth. Visit activeday.com to apply.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.
Today's conversation is with Ken Wilson, founding pastor of the Vineyard Church of Ann Arbor and author of the groundbreaking book, A Letter to My Congregation. Ken is one of the first pastors within the Vineyard movement to publicly grapple with the question of LGBTQ inclusion, not as a political issue, but as a deeply pastoral one. His story is both personal and courageous, and for the first time, he shares in full how Vineyard USA quietly pushed him out after he chose to advocate for a more compassionate and inclusive approach. In this interview, Ken reflects on his journey of conscience, the cost of speaking out, and the institutional pressures that forced a once independent thinker to the margins of the movement he helped shape. This conversation is about courage, conviction, and the struggle to hold space for everyone at the table, especially when that space is threatened by fear and control. This is my full conversation with Ken Wilson. All right, welcome back to the podcast. This is our redo. Ken Wilson, thank you so much for coming on again.
My pleasure. I hope.
No, it'll be great. You're always a joy to talk to, so I appreciate you making time as we've tried to reschedule and align our calendars. So one of the questions, as you know, that I've asked everyone who has come on, because I do think it's important to share this part of the story. Everybody who, unfortunately, a lot of folks are no longer with the Vineyard, but everyone there was originally part of the Vineyard, was drawn to the Vineyard for a good reason originally. So talk a little bit about your personal history and how you first became involved with the Vineyard.
Yeah, I think my story is actually quite characteristic for the baby boomer Vineyard pastors. I'm born in 1952. Between 52 and 1964, I'm going to the Church of the Redeemer Episcopal Church, which my wife, who's an Episcopal priest, said that was known as the GOP at prayer, the Episcopal Church back then. How things have changed, right? So mainliners back then were the power brokers, not evangelicals. Evangelicals were not into politics, and as late as 1976, evangelicals elected Jimmy Carter. So I'm raised in the sleepy Episcopal Church. After my first communion, I lose my faith after reading an Ayn Rand book, The Fountainhead, probably much before I had the emotional maturity to handle that kind of writing. So in 1970, newly graduated from Henry Ford High School in the city of Detroit. I'm newly married for the normal reason that someone gets married after high school. I'm an expectant father. I'm 18 years old. Picture this, my wife, who passed away in 2012, Nancy, she's in Sinai Hospital at Detroit, serious bleeding in the 5th month of pregnancy. The doctors come into the hospital room and say, things have gone too far, you're going to lose the baby. That night, Brian Martin, a Jesus freak from Northwest Detroit that we knew from high school, visits us, prays, has all his Jesus freak friends pray, And that night, the bleeding stops. So we moved to Ann Arbor for school, University of Michigan, and we become Jesus followers. And I think it was May 1971 when the Time magazine article about the psychedelic Jesus came out. That's when I realized I was part of a movement. Oh, darn, I thought. We're driving into Messiah Church in Southwest Detroit, much more urban part of downtown area, where Dick Bieber made a home for the hippies who were turning to Jesus in this German Lutheran church in a tough neighborhood in Detroit. So this whole era was depicted in the Jesus Revolution with Kelsey Grammer. It was kind of a cheesy movie, but it really caught the vibe of the early Jesus movement, and it featured Lonnie Frisbee, who was a player in the early days of Vineyard, as you know. Nancy and I, though, we were connected to a very quirky corner of the Jesus movement in Detroit, led by people who were reading C.S. Lewis and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Soren Kierkegaard, Oscar Kuhlmann, George Ladd, and the latter two introduced Wimber to the Kingdom of God theology, so that's interesting. So they never even said the word evangelical. The early Jesus movement that I joined was anti-war, pro-ecology, but it was also anti-institutional. And that came back to bite Vineyard. So I have stories of, some of the early Jesus freaks going to this Messiah church, and they would go to the Lutheran, I think it was ELCA or whatever the version was back then, would go to the Lutheran conventions, and a young Jesus freak would grab the big crucifix of one of the bishops and say, "Do you know this guy?" So there was this vibe, the baby boomers, we knew everything, and everyone else was your father's Oldsmobile. In 1972, up at the University of Michigan, my father, who's a World War II vet with undiagnosed PTSD. PTSD wasn't even a thing until after the Vietnam War. He takes a massive overdose of barbiturates. Dick Bieber from Messiah Church visits him in the ICU where he's impervious to pain and prays with him, and my dad wakes up in the ICU as the nurse is saying, "He can't hear you, Pastor." The doctors are overheard saying, "This is nothing short of witchcraft." I'm with my other friend in the chapel praying while all this is going on. So many Vineyard pastors have stories like these from this period. These are genuinely uncanny, inexplicable events, not some kind of Pentecostal show miracle thing. So at the University of Michigan, though, I get involved in the Catholic Pentecostal movement. It was an epicenter for the Catholic charismatic renewal. It was an ecumenical version of it, primarily Catholics. So it's Catholics and Protestants together, communal living. A sister community was the People of Praise, where Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court Justice, grew up. The Handmaid's Tale may have been informed by some things going on in these communities. They had handmaids. It kind of went south like the rest of the charismatic movement in the 1970s. So from 1975 to 1990, my wife and I, we have a growing family and a residential household, meaning we had 60 single people living with us, anywhere from 4 to 8 at a time. Not 60 altogether, but we were doing common finances for 10 years. We had Catholic cardinals and bishops visiting this community because it was kind of an amazing thing, and young people and adults and kids and journalists were coming. We're hosting the National Geographic reporter in our home for a week, and he's doing like background work for an article. I don't even know it ever came out. The Catholic leaders of the community are having private meetings with John Paul II and before him, Paul VI. It's very heady stuff. And Vineyard during this time had a similar kind of heady fame going on, and that can be very, very intoxicating. We weren't Catholic, so we hosted a home church in our living rooms in 1975 that was affiliated with this community, and that's what eventually became the Ann Arbor Vineyard. So Vineyard for us, in the mid-'80s, we were aware of John Wimber. There was intersection between these two movements. We didn't join until, I think, 1993. But Vineyard for us was a decompression chamber from this like authoritarian, intensity of charismatic Christianity in the 1980s. So that's not easy for people to recognize now as stories of Vineyard get out, but it was a real decompression chamber from a lot of the foolishness of the charismatic movement outside of Vineyard. Vineyard, of course, until his death in 1997, Vineyard was defined by John Wimber. And John Wimber was theologically appealing. He avoided the authoritarianism and the charismatic extremes of the charismatic movements around him. He was not reactionary toward contemporary culture. He emphasized visionary leadership, but kind of in an entrepreneurial business kind of way, not like heavy-handed pastoral authority, which like the 1970 charismatic movement was all about heavy-handed pastoral authority and having shepherds and, elders and all this sort of thing. He didn't have all the answers, didn't pretend to. So he was a different cat. He was not socialized as an evangelical. He grew up in a single mom's home, no religious background. Vineyard only became the darling of evangelicalism in the 1990s, and even more so after John Wimber died. Before that, it was like on the fringes of evangelicalism. When Rich and I wrote Empowered Evangelicals, I think maybe this is 95 or something like that. For a while, it was the Vineyard book. I think they probably don't promote it as much since I was a co-author. Wimber didn't like that title, Empowered Evangelicalism. So evangelicalism in the 1980s was not even as politically radicalized as it is now. That was just beginning. So early Vineyard centered in the Gospels. That was Wimber's calling card. And that meant social justice. That meant good news for the poor and for the oppressed. So you couldn't avoid social justice in the way that Wimber talked. He would even use that term, social justice. That the religious right was not even a twinkle in Jerry Falwell's eye. There was no Rush Limbaugh on Angry Man radio, AM radio. So now, though, the Vineyard grassroots is in their 60s and 70s, not in their 30s. And today, Vineyard is in the same hot mess that every evangelical church finds itself in. I mean, we're talking about Fox News on the TV, Truth Social. All of this is more powerful voices in the Vineyard grassroots than any local pastor who's speaking, once a month or once a week for 30 minutes at a time. Looking back, I can see that while I was processing LGBTQ, especially at the end, and when things were really happening in 2012 to 2014, Vineyard, along with the whole American evangelical movement, I mean, it was changing dramatically, and it was radicalizing in a toxic direction.
Yeah, it's interesting because a couple things I want to touch on that you said. It does seem that if you look at sort of the evolution or the timeline of events and sort of the evolution of the Vineyard as a movement, it does seem like it was largely held together because it did explode, pretty quickly. If you look at the time period or the time frame from, a small collection of churches to an international movement. But it does really seem like it was sort of held together. Like the glue to it all was Wimber. And when Wimber passes, it does seem like they're kind of scrambling to figure out how best to put one foot in front of the other, so to speak.
Yeah. And that's any sociologist would say that's the only way it could have been. That often these movements get started by a very entrepreneurial, outside of the box person, and he creates a very entrepreneurial culture. And then, 30 years later, though, you're not just an entrepreneurial thing. You're like a denomination, and you have responsibilities. And that was always a internal tension in Vineyard that has really been problematic.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about it sounds like it goes back a little further than I first expected, even. But talk about your theology of sexuality and LGBTQ plus inclusion early in your ministry, and maybe how it evolved over time.
Yeah, and it's a whole nother storyline, but it's the same long time frame. Back to the beginning again. So remember, in the 1970s and even into the 80s, the medical community, the psychiatric community, treated homosexuality as a disorder. I think it was taken out of the DSM diagnostic code in 1970, 73 or 74, but reparative therapy was authorized in psychiatry all the way until 1998. So people don't realize this, but there's been a big change in the medical community. Evangelicalism is just like 30 years behind the doctors. So the gay Christians that I knew as an early pastor, and I started out way too young, all the gay Christians, either hid their sexuality, or they treated it like a compulsion that they were struggling against, or as something that they had been healed from. 1975, when we had our first residential household, I later learned that 3 of the 4 men who lived with us at that time turned out to be gay. One was a conflicted gay person who was talking to me and trying to struggle against it. Another did not disclose it to me. I learned later that he died of AIDS in the 1980s, partly because he had nowhere to go with his sexuality. And it was like a shameful thing to him. So I think he was driven to places that in an affirming setting, that wouldn't have happened. And then there was a third guy I learned later who also didn't disclose being gay to me. Maybe he hadn't recognized it, who later married a man and lived a very productive life. So that's just strange. I think gay people were attracted to movements like the Charismatic Renewal and to Vineyard because it was a place where men especially could have deeper relationships and talk about more intimate things. And that just wasn't happening in the culture. So these churches have a lot of gay members in them. It wasn't until I think maybe 2001 when we moved the church from Milan to Ann Arbor, that's a whole nother story, that I actually met gay people who were not conflicted about their sexuality. So from 2001 to 2005, I noticed this growing unease with the Christian teaching that was just percolating like in my conscience almost below the surface. 2005, I connected with Phyllis Tickle, the Divine Hours, and she was the hot thing in the emergent church movement, non-movement, publishing movement for a little while there. And I started doing fixed hour prayer. I discovered Phyllis Tickle. I emailed her. We started conversing. I read some of her books. I realized she's a mystic, but she's not like copying to it. So I'm asking her about this on email. And because I'm a Vineyard pastor who's just relaxed about spiritual experience and I have a spiritual vocabulary, she starts revealing things to me about her own spiritual experience. And it turns out she was like a Teresa of Avila type mystic without any charismatic or Pentecostal input, but she's doing trilling and speaking in tongues and like traveling places in the spirit and experiencing prayer as a place you go. And it didn't come out until her biographer gave me his manuscript. And I said, "What about Phyllis the Mystic?" And he didn't know about it. And I just sent him all the emails. At the time, I just thought, this is kind of dangerous emailing a woman, number one, but she's quite a bit older than I am and in another state, so maybe it's okay. But Phyllis became like a safe person to talk to, and she was an advocate for gay Christians. By 2005, though, I was serving on the national board of Vineyard, and I was a regional overseer of 115 Vineyard churches on a volunteer basis. So we can talk about some of the structural challenges that Vineyard has been in later. So I'd say from maybe 2005 to 2010, I knew I had to resolve this question and that the traditional teaching was not adequate. No one I knew in the evangelical world or in the Vineyard world had ever grappled seriously with this. I literally had no one I could talk to in the Vineyard world without alarming them. But I plowed ahead. I started talking about it with staff pastors and whatnot. By 2006, I was confiding in Bert Wagner, the national director of Vineyard USA. Bert Wagner, pastoral, kind, not a charismatic showboater, theologically adept, curious. He was not trying to return Vineyard like many others were at that time to the glory days of the signs and wonders, 1980s Vineyard that no one can replicate. He was a post-conservative evangelical, like a Stanley Grenz post-conservative. He knew who Stanley Grenz was. He was way ahead of many Vineyard pastors who weren't reading theology. Pastors after seminary don't read theology, and half of Vineyard pastors didn't go to seminary. Vineyard pastors are reading business books. They're reading practical things. They're reading the purpose-driven life. How can I make my church work? Bert was reading theology every day. Bert never, when I started confiding in him, and it was easy to, I didn't, because he was so warm and receptive and thoughtful, he never attempted to dissuade me. And that's remarkable. Bert was working hard to make sure that Vineyard remained a big tent. He was really trying to mute the fundamentalist tendencies of Vineyard pastors. At the end of his time as national director, he was trying to get the national board to read books about what does it mean to be an institution. Nobody wanted to even acknowledge that we're an institution. But Bert's like, we are, and we have institutional responsibilities, and we need to start facing those. So I think actually that was part of maybe why Bert was not able to continue as a national director. He was really trying to deal with some very significant structural and even like value issues at the heart of Vineyard. So by 2008, I would say, I had told several national board members, only one-on-one, and you could never come up in a board meeting where I was headed. I hadn't arrived, but I was heading in a direction. They were all alarmed. Nobody wanted to talk about it further. I just felt like I was like trying to be honest with them where I was at. I knew I was out on a limb, but Bert Wagner wasn't standing at the base of a tree with a chainsaw either. And he was the national director. Maybe 2008, a national board meeting, I'm having dinner with Rich Nathan, and Rich is saying, well, where are you landing on this? And if you're landing where I think you're headed, you're outside the circle. And in Vineyard land, outside the circle is very meaningful from a centered set perspective. And we couldn't keep the conversation going. It was in a group dinner kind of context. But that, the hair in the back of my neck stood up. That was an early warning sign. But Bert was not saying that to me. And Bert was the national director. I think it's okay to mention that in earlier conversations, when Rich and I were just talking about it back and forth a little bit, he had acknowledged that homosexuality was like, at best, like a second order moral issue. Vineyard had never taken any stands on first order moral issues. No stand on when can you be remarried after divorce, which is about ongoing adultery if you're reading the gospel texts on divorce and remarriage. So when Phil Strout took over, though, which I guess he was national director-elect in 2012, and I think he took over in 2013. Everything changed, but not right away. So there was a key shift from the Bert Wagner era to the Phil Strout era in dealing with any controversial issue, and that had a big impact on me, because by 2012, our local church was well into a change process. I had written a literal letter to my congregation, not the published book that came out in 2014. We're distributing it to our 60 or 70 small group leaders or lay leaders, and we're having one-on-one conversations. We're processing it in the board and staff and key people. At the same time, I think it's hard. When we look at Vineyard, it's easy just to look at Vineyard, but Vineyard is in the middle of America, and gay marriage was becoming a national controversy. George Bush, I think, second term ran on opposing gay marriage. States were passing laws for and against gay marriage. It was like we're going up the chain to the Supreme Court. In 2012, when Phil is the national director-elect, he's calling all the board members like me to say, do you want to be part of the new team or what's going on? I kind of knew Phil did not want me on the new team, but he wasn't coming right out and saying it. So, he knew where I was headed on the gay issue, but he assured me that he wanted Vineyard to be a big tent. So that's a false positive, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think actually it could well be that Phil was sincere about that. He wasn't in the saddle. He hadn't felt the headwinds directly that face a national director from all this national controversy stuff. I don't think he was in a position to. Yeah, I don't know who could have handled it. I eventually on that call just said, I don't think I should be a national leader anymore, and I think I took him off the hook a little bit there. I just didn't want the I didn't want the attention. Still, in 2012, again, false positives. A prominent board member told me that when a gay man joins the ex-gay ministry in his local church, he has an appointment with the gay man to say, don't pray that your orientation will change. It could lead to depression and suicide. And I said, brother, are you hearing what you're saying? Why do you keep a ex-gay ministry going? But that's like, okay, Vineyard pastors are starting to tune in, I'm thinking. 2013, Exodus International disbanded. That was a big deal. The largest ex-gay organization is saying we were wrong. Vineyard had an ex-gay ministry that was under that umbrella of Exodus International. Bert tried to tackle the issue toward the end. I was actually part of a study group of board members. We never actually met. Other things happened, and it squeezed out the possibility of having that discussion. And, Bert wanted to take a let's study this together approach, which he did with women's ordination. He led the board through a lengthy period of reading and study and conversation. He asked the regents to provide opportunities for discussion and conversation and pros and cons. In our region, there was a pro and there was a con on women's ordination. It was processed like that, but this was just way too hot. April 2013 is when I did something that was it was like the point of no return. I gave a paper at the Society of Vineyard Scholars. And keep in mind, my wife had died suddenly on a Sunday in October 2012, when we were deep into our change process in the local church. We were moving forward. I had informed people that I'm the senior pastor and I am not going to implement the exclusionary discriminatory policies. I can't in good conscience do that. And people were understanding. We were moving forward. So it's 6 months later and SBS comes up. I'm finishing work on my letter to my congregation. I'm expanding it. We're distributing it and I'm reworking it. So the day arrives I'm there without my wife for the first time. The day arrives for me when I'm going to give my paper in the afternoon. In the morning session, if I've got the details right, does the name J.P. Moreland mean anything to you?
I don't think so.
Yeah, he's a very prominent conservative Christian who is active in the Philosophical Guild. He was like the conservative Christian philosopher at Biola, which is in Los Angeles, and he was a member, it turns out, of the Anaheim Vineyard.
That's right. Okay.
His presentation that morning, I did not know this was coming. His talk was titled Vineyard Gravediggers. And a gravedigger was an insider who will be the death of Vineyard because they're introducing things that will kill the vineyard. So you got to look out for the vineyard gravediggers. And he mentions people promoting mysticism. I had published a book a few years earlier, with Thomas Nelson called Mystically Wired, based on some of my experience that actually were pretty crucial in my moving forward on this whole issue. I had given workshops at a national level on evolution and climate change. And he's mentioning mysticism and evolution and LGBT. And I'm sitting in the room and I buried my wife 6 months ago. And he's labeling his talk Vineyard Gravediggers. That should have been a warning sign. After the session, it's lunchtime. I see Phil and J.P. Moreland having lunch together. And I'm going, I have lunch with another prominent board member who tells me, I think Vineyard's going to land on the wrong side of this issue. He meant the wrong side of redemptive history, not the wrong side of, whatever cultural popularity. I mean, in the afternoon, I'm giving my paper. The room is packed. It's like electric. Jay Pathak is the formal respondent to the letter. I think Kathy Maskell and Jay Pathak were the respondents. Jay Pathak being the more prominent person. He was already rising in influence at that time. You should have heard him. I mean, Ken, I just want to thank you for your paper, and I want to applaud your courage for bringing this up. This is absolutely a conversation that needs to continue, that we need to have. Phil Stroud is in the room hearing this, and Jay is speaking like that. Person after person lined up, coming up to me, says, Ken, thank you for your courage in broaching this topic and bringing this up. And I'm saying, wait a minute, what are we saying? that it takes courage for a vineyard pastor at a Society of Vineyard Scholars paper to make a presentation on this issue. Like, it shouldn't take courage. There's something wrong if it takes courage, And I admit it took some nerve on my part, but come on, we're pastors here. We're adults. We're supposed to deal with these things. Later, and it was crickets. It was crickets from the national leadership, from Phil after that, despite efforts I would make to email, hey, I'm happy to talk this over with you. If you have any questions, I think the practice was for SVS to make the papers available to vineyard pastors. My paper doesn't get loaded up. Vineyard pastors, the grapevine in Vineyard is pretty good on a topic like this. I'm getting emails from vineyard pastors. Hey, Ken, I hear you're going off the deep end or whatever. I decide, oh boy. And I decide I'm going to publish the letter to my congregation in kind of an expanded form, release it through a publisher. And it comes out. It comes out on my late wife's birthday, February 11th, 2014. At that point, David Gushee hadn't written his book. I had no cover. I had no evangelical authority figures behind me. He had written the foreword to the book, and that probably gave it a lot more prominence because he was arguably the top evangelical ethicist of his time. He had a column in Christianity Today. Vineyard pastors studied kingdom ethics at all the big seminaries. So he was a really significant figure. By that time, though, early 2014, the culture was aflame on gay marriage, right? I wasn't in control of all these factors. And as a result, I was surprised. I got my little 15 minutes of fame, and the internet was happening. I was called a heretic by Al Mohler, the Southern Baptist heresy hunter. Franklin Graham's World Vision online magazine, panned the book. Tim Keller of blessed memory panned my book, so helped sales quite a bit.
It's the old,
but I didn't have
Bailey.
I didn't have any backup from evangelical scholars. I later learned from Eugene Peterson's son that Eugene Peterson picked up the book, read it, and it resolved his questions. And when he came out a few years later and said that he would do a gay wedding, a firestorm ensued. His books were pulled off the Lifeway shelves. He's, it turns out, in an early stages of dementia. His publicist says, you've got to stop this firestorm, and so he recants. That gives you an idea of what evangelicalism was by this point. 2014, later that year, I got remarried to an Episcopal priest. This did not reassure evangelicalism. So for me, 2014 was just like a madhouse. And that's when Vineyard finally got a theological position paper together, was commissioned under the oversight of Rich Nathan. It came out. It was highly critical of my position. A national leader that I knew well, who was on the executive team, called me in advance to warn me that the paper was coming out and that it had a harsh tone toward me. And I said, well, why did you sign on to it then? Because it came out under the aegis of the executive team that he was on. And he said, well, you should have read the paper before I objected to the tone.
Yikes.
But by that time, it's just a firestorm. I didn't even have time to read the stupid paper. I did a Medium blog post 7 years later, my response to the Vineyard USA position paper, which, by the way, it's no longer available on the Vineyard USA website. It hasn't been for quite some time. If you're looking for it online, it's on the Evangelical Covenant Church website. And I think Vineyard knows that it's not a good position paper. And if you have a position paper, it sort of implies maybe you can have a conversation. Maybe you can respond to the position paper. You can say, what about this? What about that? So you can't even get I bet you probably have to write the national office. I'm a total outsider now. So long story short, how did I actually exit Vineyard? Instead of simply disaffiliating me, which is what normally happens, the senior pastor, according to the bylaws at the time, was the member of Vineyard USA, not the church body. Instead of simply disaffiliating me, Vineyard USA writes to our board, which I was part of. But this came totally out of the blue. I got no heads up on this. They're making some demands. One is that I promise not to marry a gay couple or ordain a gay person. 2, I must discipline or fire any gay leaders who are part of the church. 3, I must promise not to publicly object to the Vineyard USA policy. That was rich. I don't mean Rich Nathan. That was like choice. That was choice because there was no official policy of the Vineyard USA at that time when they wrote that letter. The position paper came out later, a couple of months later, maybe a month later. So, you can imagine getting a letter like this, and we have to make it known to the church community. What a messy process would ensue. Eventually, I decided to resign as senior pastor and launched a fully affirming church with my co-pastor Emily Swan at the end of 2014. We co-authored Soulless Jesus, A Theology of Resistance, I think in 2017. I retired in 2022. I stayed away for a year like you're supposed to, and came back and decided, I really still want to be a Christian, even though I'm not getting paid for it. And I like church, and these sermons are great. It's fun to go to church when you're not responsible for fixing everything that seems to be going wrong or whatever. So what did I learn? I learned the hard way. A church needs to leave Vineyard completely before they can safely even process this issue in their local church if they want to. You have to leave completely. You have to get away from Vineyard USA. And that's what several Vineyard churches after me did. And they made a successful transition. Tom and A.D. Wasink and many others. Anyone who stayed in Vineyard and then tried to process it, it was a disaster, as far as I know. And so when Vineyard pastors would call me, usually at the end of the process, I'd say, check your bylaws, check your ecclesial corporation papers. What about your board members? Are they connected to Vineyard USA? Just be careful and leave Vineyard USA before you process LGBTQ issue. So that's my great contribution to Vineyard. By not leaving Vineyard before processing, I taught those who followed a better approach. Yeah. So that's my gruesome tale.
One thing, though, that I know we talked about the last time you and I spoke was that, and this seems to be pretty true to form when it comes to anything that Vineyard isn't a big fan of, where they try to shove the pastor out the door, where what quickly follows after that is an intense move to control the narrative. And I think that was, if memory serves, the situation with you, where people listening to this right now are probably hearing your side of the story for the first time. And they probably only heard, the sort of sanitized version that was sort of put out there. So talk about your experience with that, like in sort of the aftermath of leaving.
Yeah, well, I want to start by just saying a thing or two in Vineyard's defense, because after the Supreme Court decision to legalize gay marriage, and that was 2015, every evangelical organization in the United States could no longer avoid the issue, and they had to come up with some statement. And every single one came down really hard on this issue. And that includes the soft evangelical groups. And Vineyard I would characterize as a soft evangelical group, like InterVarsity, working with young people on college campuses, Young Life with their high school ministry, World Vision, the Evangelical Covenant Church, which is not dissimilar to Vineyard, been around longer, talks about social justice, and that's okay. Vineyard just did it a little bit sooner, but every single evangelical organization came down hard. And there are people in those organizations who have stories of, man, this was not processed very well. And these people turned mean on us. And I think it was every evangelical organization made the calculation that if they are soft on this issue, they are going to lose big funds. They're possibly organizational, if not suicide, diminishment. And evangelicalism is not growing anymore during this time, right? It's starting to lose people. Its heyday is over. So I think no matter what dysfunction was going on in Vineyard USA, something like this would have happened. And in a sense, I put Vineyard in a tough position by giving that paper and then publishing that book in 2014. I don't think it can just be explained by Vineyard dysfunction, which apparently does exist.
A little.
Yeah. Every evangelical leader just faces intense cultural headwinds, that grew into a gale force after after Wimber's death in 1997, and it had just worsened since then. And especially now, with True Social and we're off the charts in terms, and I'm so thankful not to be in the evangelical world. I don't know how you navigate these things, and trying to come up with some process that's sane and that has integrity in the midst of these kind of pressures. I don't know leaders with the skills to do that.
Yeah, it's a very strange time.
Yeah, right.
And you're right. I think, I was having a conversation with a former pastor the other day, and we were kind of discussing, is there a right or wrong way to approach a topic like that? And, I've kind of come down on the side of, I think you owe it to your congregants to make a decision, but one way or the other, you're going to piss somebody off.
Yeah.
So like you're either going to make one side unhappy or the other side unhappy. But I think you have to at some point stop sitting on the fence and make a decision, and then in order to move forward. You know?
Vineyard had some unique weaknesses to deal with this organizationally. I really regret that Vineyard did not have a judicial process. Most denominations, Catholic Church, Southern Baptist Convention, any denomination has a judicial process where a pastor can be accused of heresy and put on trial, and the accusation is made, and you face your accuser. You have a chance to defend yourself. In 2014, when I was going through my ordeal, James Brownson at Western Theological Seminary had written his book on gender, sexuality in the Bible, and he was the dean of the Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, and he's part of the RCA, Reformed Church in America, and they put him on trial. And he defended himself, and he was exonerated. Annie Cortez from the Southern Baptist Convention in 2014 used my book when his son came out as gay, and he was put on trial. And he's in Nashville with 70 men in black suits, the 70 elders, and he gets to defend himself and make his case. And during the break, some of the men in black suits are coming up to him and saying, "Danny, no, we're keep going. We're behind you." And then, of course, everyone votes unanimously to convict him, but at least he got to defend himself.
Yeah.
I really regret that Vineyard did not have a judicial process. A judicial process protects people who are accused as much as it protects people who are bringing the accusations, right? Vineyard just had no clue about how to do a decent judicial process.
Yeah, and it seems like there's other structural issues there just in terms of like how insulated the national level is and how there are no real mechanisms for accountability, and perhaps even less so now. That's one question I did have for you, though, is strange to me. I think about it from the perspective, my dad was always a huge fan of Pope John Paul I.
Yep.
But would always talk to me about the massive divide between his theology and John Paul II. And because John Paul I wasn't in there for very long, it's the same cardinals voting for both of these individuals. And the question was always, how could they be so polar opposite? I would say that similarly with Bert Wagner to Phil Stroud, it's, explain to people who don't know from the outside how one gets elected national director in the first place within the Vineyard, and who are the decision makers?
I mean, this is very murky, and I'm not sure I'm going to give you an accurate thing. John Wimber wasn't elected, right? He dies. I think in some way he had appointed or indicated that Todd Hunter should replace him. I imagine there might have been a vote by the board at that time to recognize that. Todd Hunter has a short tenure as anyone who tried to replace John Wimber would. Bert Wagner comes on. I'm sure I wasn't on the board at the time. I'm sure there was a board vote to make him national director. At the end of Bert Wagner's tenure, he led a process to try to bring some more structure into replacing the national director, and there was more of a process that time. I think there were nominations taken from Vineyard pastors, the top, 5 people who were nominated and agreed to be in the process. I don't know what they did. They made 10-minute videos. They answered questions. There was some attempt at a process that was far beyond anything that had ever been attempted before. And that's what led to Phil Stroud being selected. I don't know if that same process was undertaken with Jay Pathak.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So that would have been a step back from what the process that the board under Bert's later leadership had come up with for replacing a national director. So there you go. I think big picture what's going on is Vineyard's evangelical. So it's looking at the not evangelicals are the liberal mainline, right? Your dad's church. And for an evangelical looking back at the liberal mainline, all they see is these hours and hours of debate about contentious issues at conventions. And then because you're surfacing all that tension and you're arguing it out, people leave the church. And the mainline churches were all in decline, partly as they're dealing with contentious issues, right? The civil rights movement, women's ordination. They were the first ones to deal with gay marriage, and it was hard. And I think Vineyard's looking at that, and evangelical things are looking at that. And if your identity is we're not mainline Protestants, we're evangelicals, and we're entrepreneurial, and we're this and that, then you're going to be afraid of any kind of decent process that allows people to debate and discuss. And we're in the 21st century. There's just one issue after another coming down the pipe there's no clear, easy answers. And there are going to be fierce debates. And we have a social media kind of world that is inflaming these debates. So I think they're just in a bind. I don't think they know what to do.
Yeah, it's remarkable, and it's sort of confounding to me looking at it from the outside, because I see a movement or at least a movement led by a group of people who seem to be pining for the glory days and a strong desire to get back to that place somehow, some way, and yet are operating from this place of fear that the movement won't last, X amount of time longer. And yet by not being transparent and arguably acting in ways that more so resemble the Godfather, are sort of expediting their own demise in that way. Like, there are pastors who have left. There are whole churches that have disaffiliated, and it's like, do you not see what you're shooting yourself in the foot right now?
But I totally agree with that. At the same time, the reality is that if they do a process, it's going to be contentious, and it's going to be hard on the organization. And I think my little book put them in a pickle, because I was simply arguing on the basis of Romans 14 and 15 that this was what Paul referred to as a disputable matter. And I was saying, since it's a disputable matter and people of good will who love Scripture and are trying to follow the Holy Spirit disagree, then we shouldn't, when we're dealing with a disputable matter like that, we shouldn't discriminate people on that basis. So I was basically arguing for affirming policies without using affirming language or an affirming position. I would say, well, let's just drop these policies of discrimination. That means gay couples can be married if a pastor is willing to marry them. A gay person can be ordained if a local church discerns that they are called and gifted. But once you acknowledge that something is a disputable matter, you're stuck, aren't you? So really after that, all Vineyard had was rhetorically to say, this is not a disputable matter. And that's what Vineyard USA has been asserting time and again since that point, because I think they know if they admit that it's a disputable matter, then it would be like, well, why not allow local churches to decide? A church either has a gay pastor or don't. There's no middle ground between doing gay weddings, as categorically, or allowing a gay person to serve as a pastor categorically. There's no middle ground there. And so if once you admit that at the denominational level, the only reasonable thing is to allow local churches to do that. But I remember a prominent leader when all this was hitting the fan, and he said to me, Ken, you understand that in my local church, I have 6-figure givers who are saying, if Vineyard allows Ken Wilson to do what he's doing in Ann Arbor, we will stop giving to our local church here, right? So yes, the problem is in the Vineyard USA leadership structure. John Wimber, from the very beginning, planted ambivalence about organizing. And so I think he planted the seeds that made it very difficult for those who succeeded him to do the important work of organization that you have to do when you're 30 years old or 40 years old, or you have 600 churches or all that kind of thing. And Vineyard was trying to do that on a dime compared to other churches, and John Wimber, God bless his soul, planted the seeds of ambivalence about being an institution and being a denomination. So if we're going to be loyal to denomination, to John Wimber, we have to be a relational network and not a denomination. Well, why can't you be a denomination and a relational network? People can love each other within denominations, but this is the sort of the mythic structure of Vineyard that, in a sense, goes back to John Wimber, that the leaders in Vineyard are contending with, and it totally makes sense to me that they're coming up with incoherent responses.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that once a network or a movement grows to such a size that you can kind of get away with that for a while if you have a really charismatic, strong leader who, sort of is the person that you can defer to on all things that become contentious. But once you no longer have that, then it kind of becomes clear that their structure is sort of necessary if you intend on carrying forward. And you can call it a denomination or not. I would say just say, hey, look, in order for us to maintain health as a movement, we need to acknowledge that certain policies and procedures need to be in place in order for us to be accountable and
Yes.
hold each other accountable and that sort of thing. And I don't understand the sort of allergy, to implementing a little structure into the system.
That was the heritage of John Wimber. John Wimber was ambivalent. John Wimber allowed his junior lieutenants to organize Vineyard USA as an association of churches. And there's a famous meeting. I was not a Vineyard pastor at that time. I think it was in Denver, where they came and they were going to vote on it. And John Wimber blew it up. He said, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to become an association of churches. And so they went back to the drawing board and eventually prevailed on John Wimber to have an association of churches. But I think John Wimber knew that he didn't have the gifts to run a thing like this. It's a lot of work. And it's not the fun kind of conference work. It's hard. And so I think this has just been something, I know there are individuals who are not handling themselves well in this thing, but I don't know how I would handle myself if I were a national leader. I would hope I would have the integrity not to do some of the things that I've heard or some of the things that I experienced. But I think my only alternative would be to say, I'm sorry, I can't do this. There's something about the structure of the system itself.
Well, don't say that, Ken, because then you become the perfect candidate. The age-old saying, like, the person who doesn't want power is the right person for the job,
Yeah,
the person who really wants it is probably not the right guy for the job.
Yeah, and I'm very passionate about LGBTQ inclusion for obvious reasons, and I think any evangelical organization is not a safe place for gender and sexual minorities, and I would rather have the ones that exist come to grips with that, acknowledge that, put it on their websites what their policies are, rather than to get some kind of process going that inevitably won't lead to inclusion because of the political realities. How are you going to have LGBT inclusion when a good percentage of congregants are tuned into social media that is rabidly opposed to it? I mean, that's the reality. I mean, the mainline churches are on paper affirming, but that just means that it's okay for some congregations to have gay pastors. In the mainline congregations, there are congregations that can decide not to have a woman clergy and not to have a gay pastor and not to do gay weddings. They're considered affirming denominations, but it's okay not to do a gay wedding, right? So, this is a mess for Christianity, and Vineyard is just in a really, I'd say, compromised position to deal with it in any kind of healthy way. Maybe I'm being too kind, but it's easy. It's easy to we all want to blame someone, and there's always someone to blame. But these people are caught in a system that is it's incredibly hard.
Yeah, I think you touched on exactly the right thing, which is anytime you're dealing with life is not dualistic. It's not black and white. It's not cut and dry. It's very nuanced and complex. Living this out in life, it's very complex and nuanced, and no one's all good and all bad. And, there's a lot of complexity in the situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
For sure.
Organizations, in order to handle this with integrity, I think they need to be willing to say, we're going to lose at least a quarter of our people and a third of our income. At a local church level, that's pretty true of churches that go affirming from a non-affirming position. You have to be ready to lose at least a quarter of the people and probably more like a third of the income. Large organizations always opt for like short-term reducing losses, right? And so that kind of a system just breeds leaders who are trying to fudge it, trying to keep the coalition together, saying one thing to one group and another thing to another group, and it becomes more like a political process. That's
a really good way to look at it. Because we've been sort of making this comparison throughout the series between the church movement and corporation, and I think that's exactly it. And you're right. I think you can look at some recent examples. The United Methodist Church and the LCA Lutheran Church, finally took a stance on one side or the other. And when they voted to become affirming, there were quite a few churches that left and started their own subcategory of Lutheran, I guess. For those that don't know, there's many different flavors of Lutheran. But
hats off to the United Methodists. Hats off to the United Methodists who knew darn well that if they made their decision, they were going to lose a whole bunch of really good United Methodist churches in America, and they decided to do that. Maybe, and John Wimber was like, unless you're willing to risk the whole thing, you can't take the next step forward. That was a John Wimber principle. You have to be ready to risk the whole thing in order to go forward. And people are not willing to do that. And I understand why, because it means you have to have layoffs. There are people who have jobs. It's bloody, and so it's a real dilemma that these people are facing. That's why I'm a post-evangelical.
Well, that's a good place to sort of put a bow on it.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts or things that you feel like people should know before we end?
Yeah, but just there might be some Vineyard pastors listening, and or pastors from non-affirming church denominations. This is happening everywhere. Everyone's mishandling it. And their conscience is bothered because they have a gay son or a gay daughter or a transgender child, or they have a parent who is gay or a sibling who is gay. And they know these people up close and personal, and they understand that Romans 1 does not characterize the people that they know and love who are gay. And they're in a real bind. And I just want to say to those pastors, do you really want to outsource your conscience and your pastoral vows to the leadership of your denomination? In the case of Vineyard, I would say that that's not a good bet. If you're part of the Episcopal Church and there's this whole process of dealing with debates and whatever, sure, you say, I'm going to let it play out and I'll play by the rules. But if you're a Vineyard pastor, in this kind of Wild West approach, entrepreneurial approach, movement, not denomination, do you want to outsource your conscience and your pastoral vows not to do harm as like the first rule of love is do no harm? Do you want to outsource that to who is it? Who are the people? Can you even name the people that you're outsourcing your conscience to? Sometimes you can't even name who the people are. Who is making the decisions? What is their background? Have they studied it? What are their vested interests? How much are they getting paid? And do they know that they will lose their job if they allow this? I mean, there's all sorts of factors. But, if John Wimber had anything to say that was helpful to the church at large, it was that to be a Christian is first to be a follower of Jesus. And the pattern for what it means to follow Jesus, you can read in the Gospels. And pick up your cross, bite the bullet, play the man Polycarp, and do what's hard, or get a different kind of job.
Perfect. That's a good way to end it. Love it. Thank you so much, Ken, for coming back on. I know last time that we recorded was a tough time. I can't even imagine. So thank you so much for coming back on again to talk about something that's really important and a really crucial piece to the story that is unfolding as we speak.
Thank you, John.
The views and opinions expressed in this interview are those of the guest and host and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of any organization mentioned. This conversation is provided for informational purposes only and should not be interpreted as legal, theological, or psychological advice. All individuals and institutions discussed are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Listener discretion is advised, especially for those impacted by religious trauma or exclusion.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.